In the summer of 1987, a social worker in rural Kentucky made a discovery that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Behind a rotting farmhouse door, she found something that challenged everything she thought she knew about human genetics. The locals called it God's punishment. The medical examiner called it an impossibility. But the Holloway family, they called it their blessing. What you're about to hear is a story that 3 generations tried to bury. A story about what happens when a bloodline turns in on itself for so long that nature itself begins to rebel. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The call came in at 3:47 a.m. on July 15, 1987. Margaret Thornfield had been a social worker in Breathitt County, Kentucky for 12 years, and she thought she'd seen everything rural poverty could throw at her. Malnourished children, homes without running water, families living in conditions that belonged in another century, but nothing had prepared her for what she would find at the end of Holloway Ridge Road. The complaint was routine. Neighbors reporting strange sounds coming from the old Holloway place. Crying, they said, but not like any crying they'd ever heard. Animal-like, one caller described it. Inhuman, said another. The sheriff's department had been out there twice, but nobody answered the door. The third time they brought Margaret along. The Holloway farmhouse sat like a cancer on the landscape, its white paint peeling away to reveal rotting wood underneath. Windows were boarded up with mismatched planks, and the front porch sagged under the weight of decades of neglect. But it was the smell that hit Margaret first, a sweet, sickly odor that seemed to seep from the very walls of the structure. When they finally forced their way inside, Margaret's flashlight beam cut through darkness so thick it felt almost solid. The interior was a maze of makeshift barriers and hanging sheets, creating a labyrinth of hidden spaces. And from somewhere deep within that maze came the sound the neighbors had described, a rhythmic, keening wail that raised the hair on the back of Margaret's neck. What they found in the back bedroom would later be described in medical journals as genetically impossible. But Margaret would never forget the moment her flashlight first illuminated the crib in the corner. And she realized that some family secrets are kept not out of shame, but out of a terror so profound it can only be met with silence. The Holloway bloodline had been folding in on itself for over a century. And this was where it had led them. To understand what Margaret found in that crib, we have to go back to 1847 when Ezekiel Holloway first settled in the hills of eastern Kentucky. Ezekiel was a man running from something, though the records never say what. He brought with him 2 wives, Sarah and Rebecca, sisters who had followed him into the wilderness with a devotion that bordered on worship. The Holloway patriarch had a vision for his family that went beyond mere survival. He believed that bloodlines were sacred, that mixing with outsiders would dilute what he called the pure essence of his lineage. In his personal journal, discovered decades later, Ezekiel wrote, "God has chosen us to remain untainted by the corruption of the world. Our blood shall remain our blood, and our children shall know the strength that comes from purity." What started as religious conviction quickly became rigid doctrine. Ezekiel's children married each other. Their children followed suit. By the 1870s, the Holloway family tree had become something more resembling a telephone pole, straight up and down, with branches that curved back into themselves like arthritic fingers. The first signs of trouble appeared in the 3rd generation, children born with extra fingers, or sometimes missing them entirely, mild intellectual disabilities that the family attributed to God's special blessing, deafness that ran through the bloodline like a genetic signature. But these were small prices to pay, the family believed, for maintaining their purity. By the early 1900s, the Holloways had developed their own language, a mixture of archaic English and sounds that seemed to bypass the throat entirely. They communicated through gestures and guttural noises that outsiders couldn't interpret. The few neighbors who remained in the area began to cross themselves when they passed the Holloway property, and mothers would pull their children inside when they heard the family's distinctive calls echoing through the hills. The isolation deepened with each generation. The Holloways stopped coming to town entirely by 1920. They grew their own food, made their own clothes, and most importantly, married their own blood. Uncle to niece, first cousin to first cousin, and in some cases, relationships that were so tangled that genealogists would later give up trying to map them entirely. By the 1940s, something fundamental had shifted in the Holloway bloodline. What had once been minor oddities, an extra toe here, a speech impediment there, had evolved into something far more sinister. Dr. Nathan Crenshaw, the county's only physician at the time, made house calls to the Holloway property 3 times between 1943 and 1945. His private notes, discovered after his death, paint a picture of a family that was slowly dissolving at the genetic level. The children, Dr. Crenshaw wrote, display characteristics I have never encountered in medical literature: severe cranial malformations, limbs that appear to bend in directions that should not be anatomically possible, and eyes that seem to track movement independently of one another. Most disturbing is their apparent inability to recognize pain in the traditional sense. I observed a young boy place his hand directly on a hot stove and continue to hold it there while smiling. The family patriarch during this era was Josiah Holloway, Ezekiel's great-grandson, who had married his own sister and produced 7 children with her. When she died during the birth of their 8th child, Josiah took his eldest daughter, then barely 14, as his new wife. The children from this union were different. Neighbors reported seeing them in the woods at night, moving on all fours with an agility that seemed impossible for their twisted frames. Dr. Crenshaw's final note about the family is perhaps the most chilling. I believe the Holloways have crossed some biological threshold from which there is no return. What I witnessed in that house challenges not only medical science but the very definition of human. They appear to be evolving, or perhaps devolving, into something entirely new. I will not be returning to their property. Some knowledge is too dangerous to possess. The last outsider to successfully interact with the Holloway family was a traveling preacher named Reverend Marcus Kane in 1952. He stayed with them for 3 days attempting to bring them back to God's light. His diary from those 3 days survived, though many pages are illegible due to what appears to be water damage or tears. They speak in tongues, Reverend Kane wrote, but not the holy tongues of the Spirit. These are sounds that come from some deeper place, some primordial part of the human soul that we were meant to leave behind. The children, God help me, the children are not entirely children anymore. They move like shadows, and when they look at you, you can see intelligence there, but it is an alien intelligence. They understand things we do not, and they see things we cannot. From 1952 to 1987, the Holloway family vanished from all official records, no births registered, no deaths reported, no contact with the outside world. For 35 years, they existed in a pocket of isolation so complete that the rest of the world simply forgot they were there. But the absence of documentation doesn't mean the absence of activity. If anything, those silent decades were when the Holloway bloodline reached its final, terrible conclusion. During this period, the family structure collapsed entirely. Traditional relationships, parent, child, sibling, spouse, became meaningless categories in a clan where everyone was related to everyone else in multiple ways. The family tree had become so twisted that children were being born to parents who were simultaneously their cousins, aunts, uncles, and siblings. Genetic material that had been recycling through the same bloodline for over a century had created combinations that shouldn't have been possible. Local hunters would sometimes catch glimpses of figures moving through the woods around the Holloway property. They described beings that walked upright but seemed to flow rather than step, with limbs that appeared to bend at impossible angles. Their faces, when glimpsed through the trees, were said to be arranged in ways that hurt to look at directly, features that seemed both too large and too small, positioned where features shouldn't be. The family had long since abandoned agriculture, surviving instead through means that remain unclear. Some speculated they had reverted to a more primitive existence, hunting and foraging like their distant ancestors. Others suggested something darker, that they had found ways to sustain themselves that didn't bear close examination. The occasional disappearance of livestock from neighboring farms added weight to these darker theories. During this time, the few remaining neighbors began to report strange phenomena. Electronic devices would malfunction when pointed toward the Holloway property. Photographs came out distorted, showing strange shadows and shapes that weren't visible to the naked eye. Radio broadcasts would be interrupted by sounds that seemed to come from no earthly source, a mixture of crying, laughing, and something that sounded almost like singing, but in frequencies that made listeners feel physically ill. By the 1980s, even the bravest locals had learned to avoid Holloway Ridge Road entirely. The mailman left mail at the base of the hill. Utility workers refused to service the area. The property had become a dead zone in the middle of Breathitt County, a place where civilization had simply given up trying to penetrate. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? When Margaret Thornfield's flashlight finally illuminated that crib in 1987, she was looking at the culmination of 140 years of genetic isolation. The thing in the crib, and calling it a thing feels wrong, but calling it a child feels impossible, represented the absolute end point of the Holloway family's experiment in bloodline purity. Medical examiner Dr. Patricia Hensley was called to the scene 3 hours later. Her official report, which remained classified for decades, described an infant that challenged every assumption about human development. The skull was elongated beyond anything seen in medical literature, with bone formations that seemed to spiral inward on themselves. The limbs were arranged in patterns that defied anatomy, arms that branched like tree limbs with what appeared to be multiple joint systems operating simultaneously. But it was the eyes that haunted everyone who saw them. 7 eyes arranged in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, each one tracking movement independently. They weren't the cloudy, unfocused eyes of a typical newborn. These eyes held an intelligence that was ancient and alien, as if something very old was looking out from behind them. The infant appeared to be aware of our presence in ways that should have been impossible, Dr. Hensley wrote in her private notes. It responded to stimuli that hadn't yet occurred, turning its head toward sounds before they were made, reaching for objects before they were visible. Most disturbing was its reaction to its parents. It seemed to recognize them not as individuals but as components of itself. The parents, if they could still be called that, were the last surviving members of the Holloway clan. Elijah and Sarah Holloway were themselves the product of generations of inbreeding, their features so distorted by genetic damage that determining their actual relationship to each other and to the infant became impossible. They existed in a state of devotion to their child that transcended normal parental love and entered the realm of religious worship. In the weeks following the discovery, geneticists from the University of Kentucky attempted to map the infant's DNA. What they found was a genetic code so twisted and recursive that it seemed to defy the basic laws of heredity. Chromosomes had doubled back on themselves in patterns that shouldn't have been compatible with life, creating a biological impossibility that somehow continued to breathe, grow, and develop. What happened next reveals how far authorities will go to bury truths that threaten our understanding of what it means to be human. Within 72 hours of the discovery, federal agencies had descended on Breathitt County with a speed and efficiency that suggested they had been monitoring the situation far longer than anyone realized. Margaret Thornfield was reassigned to a desk job in Lexington and required to sign documents that legally prevented her from discussing what she had witnessed. Dr. Hensley's official report was sealed and replaced with a sanitized version that described severe genetic abnormalities consistent with prolonged inbreeding. The infant and its parents simply vanished from all records, as if they had never existed at all. But erasure is never complete. Hospital staff who had glimpsed the infant before its transfer began experiencing collective nightmares. Nurses reported dreaming of corridors filled with cribs, each containing something that was almost, but not quite, human. Security guards quit without explanation after reviewing footage from the hospital's morgue where the infant had been temporarily housed. The Holloway property was purchased by an unnamed government entity within a month of the discovery. The farmhouse was demolished. The land was scraped clean and a perimeter was established that remains in effect to this day. Official records list it as an environmental contamination site, but locals know better. They know that some contaminations go deeper than soil and water. The surviving members of the Holloway family, Elijah and Sarah, were relocated to what officials called a specialized care facility. Former employees of the facility, speaking anonymously decades later, described a place that was part asylum, part laboratory, and part prison. The Holloways were studied, tested, and documented with the thoroughness of specimens rather than patients. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a geneticist who worked at the facility from 1988 to 1991, broke her silence in 2003, shortly before her death from cancer. They weren't trying to help the Holloways, she revealed. They were trying to understand them. The government wanted to know how far human genetics could be pushed before breaking entirely. The Holloways had provided a natural experiment in genetic extremes, and the results were too valuable to simply dispose of. According to Dr. Morrison, the infant continued to develop in ways that defied medical understanding. It grew rapidly, but not uniformly, parts of its body aging at different rates. Its consciousness expanded to encompass an awareness that seemed to extend beyond its physical boundaries. Most disturbing of all, it appeared to be influencing the genetic expression of other organisms in its vicinity. Plants wilted in unnatural patterns and small animals brought near it would develop temporary mutations. Today, nearly 4 decades after Margaret Thornfield made her horrific discovery, the Holloway name has been scrubbed from most official records. The family cemetery on their former property was relocated in the dead of night, headstones ground to powder and scattered. Birth certificates were altered, death records modified, and genealogical databases cleansed of any trace that the Holloways had ever existed. But secrets this dark have a way of leaving permanent scars on the landscape of human knowledge. In medical journals buried in footnotes and coded language, researchers still reference the Kentucky case when discussing the theoretical limits of genetic degradation. University genetics programs use sanitized versions of Holloway DNA samples to study the effects of extreme inbreeding, though students are never told the true source of their specimens. The child, whatever it had become, officially died in 1994, according to sealed government records obtained through Freedom of Information requests. But Dr. Morrison's final testimony suggests something far more disturbing. It didn't die in any conventional sense, she revealed. It simply distributed itself. By the end, we couldn't determine where its consciousness ended and its environment began. It had become something that existed both within and beyond its physical form. The implications of this statement become clearer when you examine the pattern of genetic anomalies that began appearing in Kentucky hospitals after 1994. Births with impossible combinations of inherited traits. Children born with genetic markers from bloodlines that had supposedly ended generations ago, as if something was still out there, still influencing human genetic expression in ways that science couldn't explain or predict. Local folklore in eastern Kentucky has developed its own interpretation of the Holloway legacy. They speak of a bloodline curse, a contamination that spreads not through genetics, but through proximity to the truth itself. Families who live too close to the former Holloway property report dreams that feel like inherited memories, visions of twisted family trees and children who are both ancestor and descendant, parent and offspring. The most disturbing aspect of the Holloway story isn't what it tells us about the dangers of genetic isolation. It's what it reveals about the flexibility of human biology when pushed to its absolute limits. The Holloways didn't just break the rules of genetics. They discovered new rules that we are still too frightened to acknowledge. In the end, the Holloway family achieved exactly what Ezekiel had envisioned when he first settled in those Kentucky hills. They had maintained the purity of their bloodline, kept their genetic heritage uncontaminated by outside influence. They had created something uniquely their own, something that had never existed before and will hopefully never exist again. The question that haunts geneticists to this day is whether the Holloways represent an evolutionary dead end, or if they were the first glimpse of something that human biology is still struggling to become. And somewhere in a sealed government facility, in files that will never see daylight, lies the documentation of what humanity looks like when it finally stops being human. Some family secrets are kept not out of shame, but out of a terror too profound for words. The Holloway bloodline is one of those secrets. And now, unfortunately, it's yours to carry as well.